the grassy knoll's got a gun. He's gonna shoot the president. Holy smokes, I've gotta do something. All right, Lee, time to become an American hero.
22 November Network and Neapolis Media proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast with your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths comes to die. Stay tuned, be right there.
One of the more important things that people don't discuss is about this fellow named Robert McEwen. And to me, Robert McEwen is one of the keys to understanding the assassination. Robert McEwen was a CIA gun runner. No doubt about it. He was, he ran guns to Castro, knew Castro personally very, very well. McEwen was interviewed by the House Select Committee for hours. Those tape recordings, which I made copies of, are in the National Archives. They're available to researchers. And if you listen to McEwen and his conversations with the House Select Committee, you get a very, very different view of what was going on. And if that rifle would have been purchased, if McEwen would have sold Oswald that rifle, you can bet that rifle would have wound up on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Another thought that I had about the rifle in connection with McEwen, what occurred to me was, if they're trying to buy a rifle or rifles from McEwen, assassination weapons, maybe that whole Kleins thing never happened in March. They hadn't even chosen the assassination weapon yet. That's why they're trying to get one from McEwen.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode number 103 of the Lone Gunman Podcast. This is your boy Rob Clark, your host, your captain of the ship, and tonight I have a mismatch potpourri of subjects that I'd like to discuss with you. All kinds of stuff. And starting off there, the voice you just heard was John Armstrong, noted researcher, author of Harvey and Lee, on Black Hop Radio, discussing the role of Robert McEwen. Now, for those of you who don't know who Robert McEwen is, he was an individual who owned business in Cuba under the Batista regime. And he was subsequently booted out of the country by Batista. And when Castro took over, while Castro was planning the overthrow, McEwen was instrumental in shipping guns and armaments and all this stuff to Castro in Cuba. And to illustrate the fact, that Castro and McEwen were very good friends. When Castro came to the United States, shortly after he took power, he gave a speech to the UN, and on his way back to Cuba, he stopped in Houston. Okay, and he was photographed as he got off the plane in Houston, meeting Robert McEwen. Okay, this is how much he liked this guy, and he invited McEwen back to Cuba, and told him, he could have a position in his government, or he would give him whatever business he wanted, but McEwen was on probation because they had caught him, running guns to Cuba, and he wasn't allowed to leave the country legally. So he kind of turned Castro down, but they still remained very close friends. And then, later on, there was an incident involving McEwen's brother and some of his friends where they were arrested by members of Castro's army and thrown in jail in Cuba. And upon hearing this, McEwen called Castro and was like, I need you to do me a favor, and he explained the situation. And Castro put all these guys on a plane and got them back to the United States. So this is the kind of friendship that McEwen had forged with Fidel Castro. And the reason we bring him up here, and John Armstrong touched on it, is, Lee Harvey Oswald in early September. Well, I'm sorry. It was actually a few weeks before the assassination, so it would have been sometime in early November on a Saturday. McCown told the HSCA that Oswald, a man identifying himself as Lee Oswald, and another man, Latino man, he called Hernandez, showed up at his door one Saturday morning, and Oswald was like, are you McCown? My name is Lee Oswald, and we'd like for you to get us some guns. We heard that all the work you did for Castro and everything. We'd like you to get us some guns. We'd be willing to pay you a lot of money. And I'm talking either, I've seen it in two places. One where he offers him $1,000 per gun for 300 Savages with scopes, fully automatic rifles. And I've also seen it 10,000 for 4. That's a pretty damn good offer. But McCown smelled a rat, and because he figured, and he told Oswald this. He's like, man, you can go to Sears and Roebuck and get the rifles you need for about $35 a piece. What do you need me for to get you these rifles and pay an exorbitant amount of money for them? Oh, we just know that you can get them, and this, that, and the other. But McCown wasn't having it. He's told him basically to get to stepping. And they did. They left, and then a couple minutes later, Oswald came back to the door and pleaded with him again. And that may be where he upped his offer. And McCown still told him no, that it's not going to happen. That he was on probation and he couldn't mess around with anything like that because he smelled a rat. I mean, could you imagine if, like Armstrong was saying, if McCown had supplied these rifles to Oswald, then I am damn certain that that's one of the rifles that would have been found in the school book depository, because it could have been tied back to Castro's gun runner. I mean, that was a headline in the newspaper, in the Houston newspaper, when Castro came to see McCown. He's, Castro's gun runner. Okay, so if they would have found a gun supplied by Castro's personal friend and gun runner, Robert McCown, in the school book depository, they would have had zero problem tying Oswald back to Castro and the communists and make a real clear link there. And they would have had to do something at that point. And something Armstrong alluded to about the rifle is that, that possibly at this point, they weren't even sure what rifle that they were going to use in the assassination, and that possibly this whole Klein's thing was, fabricated relatively quickly after the assassination. Because, look, I know the lone nut guys think that everything's legit with all this gun stuff, but when you take a closer look at some of the problems, as many great researchers have pointed out, such as John Armstrong, David Josephs, Gil Jesus, when you look really closely at these Klein rifles that, or the Klein rifle that was supposedly sent to Oswald, and of course the pistol, which is a different story, but I mean the rifle itself, there's absolutely no proof whatsoever that Oswald was sent this rifle to his P.O. box. There's zero proof of it at all. There's no record of shipment. There's no receipts from the post office. There's no nothing. And the rifle was sent COD. He did send a deposit, but there was some to be paid on delivery. And of course there's no record of that whatsoever. There's problems with the money order that Oswald supposedly sent with the rifle, and that it didn't have the correct stamps on it to go through the correct banks to end up where it was supposed to end up. It was actually somewhere else. And, there's all kinds of problems. The FBI went to Klein's after the assassination, looking for anything connecting Oswald to ordering a rifle, and they couldn't find anything. And then finally, at 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturday the 23rd, they finally, they were like, look, we're just going to take all this microfiche back to Washington, and we'll look through it there. And that's what they did. They took all this microfiche and stuff back to Washington, and then miraculously they find the order form. And of course, supposedly the order form wasn't filled out by Oswald himself, and of course it wasn't addressed to Oswald himself. It was addressed to his alias, Alec Heidel. So there's all kinds of problems with these rifles. And I could see a scenario that could have quickly produced the paperwork after the assassination to run this gun back to Oswald via his alias very quickly. So yeah, just imagine for a second, if they would have found a rifle obtained from McEwen, Castro's personal gun runner, all hell would have broke loose. There would have been no denying it at that point that the communists were behind Oswald. And then our government would have been forced to act, forced to do something, because then they could prove definitively that Oswald, this crazy communist with ties directly back to Castro, was behind the assassination. Fortunately, Robert McEwen was too smart to fall for this, so they had to go with another plan. Now, one other thing about Robert McEwen, okay, when he went to the HSCA, his lawyer was Mark Lane. And look, I'm going to tell you like this. I got a lot of problems with Mark Lane, okay? And I think I'm going to do a show coming up in a little while about Mark Lane. And we're going to really take a good look at Mr. Mark Lane. So keep an eye out for that. But, this guy pops up in the weirdest places at the weirdest times. But when McCown was supposed to give his testimony, because there was some kind of a book deal with W.M. Morris, and there was a TV deal with the BBC with McEwen, and all kinds of stuff that Lane had his fingers in. But when McCown had to go in front of the HSCA to testify, Mark Lane had a previous, more important commitment. So there left McCown all by his little lonesome self to talk to the HSCA investigators, and he did not want to talk. They wanted to postpone their little conversation to a later date, pending, when Mark Lane could be there. And they pretty much told him, look, we don't need to wait for your lawyer. It's not like you're on trial here for anything. We just need your testimony. And it was at that point that they told him, look, we're offering you immunized testimony. Anything you say, nothing can be done to you. It's basically, you can say whatever you want, hopefully the truth, and whatever it is, it's not going to be held against you. You're not going to be charged with anything. It's just, we need the information. So they finally convinced McCown to talk. And of course, he told him about this Oswald visit. And he told him a bunch of other things. And the story of the Oswald visit didn't exactly come out right away. In fact, he was being investigated back then. Of course, the FBI was on McCown pretty good, because they thought he was a commie lover and aiding the communists and this and that. So they were watching him. He was, like I said, he was on probation. He'd spent some time in jail, and they were talking to him, through the years at various points in times. But he never did mention this Oswald thing until the 70s, until the HSCA and this documentary on the BBC. So he told him about the Oswald thing, but the reason that they had known about him actually was back in the late 50s. He was, I forget where he was living. I want to say, yeah, it was Houston. And he was approached by a cop buddy that he knew who said that he knew a guy in Dallas that wanted to talk to him. Would it be okay to give him his number? And McCown said, sure, that's fine. So, guess who calls Robert McCown in 1959? Jack Ruby. Actually, Jack Rubenstein is how he identified himself to McCown. And he asked McCown, he said, look, I want to talk to you about some things. Is it okay if I come visit? McCown said, sure, you can come visit. So he said this guy shows up, real nice dressed, a suit, tie, hat, fedora, and he shows up at his place of business down there and wants to talk to him. And there's various elements to the story depending on where you hear it from and who's telling it. But the crux of the story is this, that Jack Ruby wanted McCown to use his connections to Castro. He said he had a bunch of Jeeps, military-style Jeeps, and armaments and things that he wanted to get to Castro. Could McCown facilitate, a meeting or an introduction to Castro? And there was also some kind of a letter that Jack Ruby wanted from McCown saying, to Castro, vouching for him. I guess saying he was a good guy or whatever, because Jack Ruby wanted to get, I think it was 5 guys out of jail down there. And once again, McCown was offered an exorbitant amount of money. It was, first it was like $5,000. And he said Jack Ruby came back like 3 or 4 days in a row. And it was finally up to like $25,000, that he was offering McCown for this letter. This letter of introduction and vouching, for Jack. And McCown told him, said, look, you want the letter? You show me some money. Show me you're interested, truly interested in this, and you'll get your letter, But Jack Ruby never did produce the money. And, he kind of stopped hearing from him. So he just figured the matter dropped. Now, when Ruby was arrested, he told of a vague story of something like this, but he mentioned that the man's name was Davis, and in the wrong kind of general area. But he said he approached him about, some Jeeps, some armaments, things like that. And they did investigate this way back, but the Warren Commission never did. The FBI never brought it up to the Warren Commission. McCown was never called before the Warren Commission or investigated then. It wasn't until the HSCA and that his story had come out a little bit that they wanted to talk to this guy and get it down exactly what was going on. So, call me a coincidence theorist if you want to, but it seems awfully funny to me that Jack Ruby would approach McCown about Castro and this and that and the other. And then Oswald would, a couple weeks before the assassination, approach McCown about some rifles. Now, how do you figure that Lee Oswald would have heard about Robert McCown? Because when all this stuff was going on, with McCown and Castro, Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps. He was in Japan. And then he went straight to Russia for 2.5 years. So he had to hear about McCown from somebody. And that somebody is probably Jack Ruby. Now, a couple episodes ago, I spoke to you about William Duff and his so-called, him fingering, Jack Ruby as a kind of some kind of a conspirator with General Walker in this whole business, because, Of course, after the assassination, we have Jack Ruby scared to death of the John Birch Society and General Walker, and he tells the Warren Commission this. We have Ruby acting like a crazy person the morning after the assassination, dragging Larry Crayford and George Senator out to take pictures of billboards and flyers and going to stake out P.O. boxes, of the John Birch Society and Robert Surrey, and who's a known associate of General Walker. So you have Ruby very scared of these guys, very scared. And, the connections are there. It just seems, that it seems to me like there was some kind of a plan in place, and we don't even know for sure that it was Oswald that went out to visit McCown. We just have McCown's word that he recognized the guy after the assassination and put two and two together. So, but he was pretty much shook after that because he knew he was that somebody was trying to set him up, pretty good. If it would have found that there was a gun that he got for this known communist, Lee Oswald from all hell would have broke loose. He would have been fingered in this whole thing too. So, that kind of scared Robert McCown, and he didn't tell anybody about it, like I said, till the 70s and the HSCA. And in this documentary, Morris was going to write a book with McCown telling his story and his connections and this and that, but I don't think it ever formally got done. I think there was a rough draft or a manuscript or something to that effect, but I don't think it ever saw the light of day. So yeah, it's just crazy how all this stuff comes to pass, and all these people are involved in this, that, and the other. I was reading an interview with I think he talked to the HSCA, Raymond Brashears. He was a friend of David Ferry. He was his roommate for a time. And, Ferry allegedly told this guy all kinds of stuff in confidence, Now, here's an interesting nugget. Brashears claims, that he met Ferry when actually Brashears was handing out Christian Crusade literature from Billy James Hargis, the Midnight Ride guy with the crazy anti-communist preacher that General Walker went on his crusade with there in the beginning months of '63. So we have Brashears handing out this literature of Billy James Hargis on a corner of the street in the French Quarter. And Brashears claimed that he was not a homosexual at the time, and he didn't know that Ferry was one. Brashears explained that at the time he was a vehement anti-communist and evangelist. He felt the Christian Crusade literature was the best of its kind in the religion anti-communist movement. He passed a copy of the literature to Ferry, who was intrigued by it and wanted to talk further at a nearby bar. These two guys are talking. Ferry was telling Brashears, he thinks it's great what he's doing in his anti-communist work, and Brashears told him of others doing similar work and mentioned a guy named Robert Depew, who was head of the Minutemen at the time, as another who was greatly concerned with the rising communist tide in America. And Brashears said that he had connections with Depew's Missouri operation. Ferry introduced Brashears to the Orthodox Old Catholic Church of North America, and they became fast friends on both political and religious basis. Ferry and Brashears discussed the Cuban situation, which they felt had deteriorated during Kennedy's tenure, as well as communism. Ferry discussed the anti-Castro Cuban activity that was taking place in New Orleans at the time. So once again, to get back to the crux of things here, and I'm reading a couple things here tonight from General Walker and the murder of President Kennedy, because it's important. I can't stress to you how important this book is in the big scheme of understanding exactly what happened and understanding the climate of the time that these people were living in and the environment that they were surrounding themselves in. You know, it's just insane to me. Now, when he was talking to the HSCA, Breshears stated this, that Ferry was extremely angry with President Kennedy. He thought Kennedy sold out the country to the communists. The two men agreed that Kennedy was not telling the truth to the media about Cuba. Okay, and he noted that Ferry was a pilot and flew private planes to various places such as Mexico and the Caribbean. And in 1965, Ferry had told him that he was engaged in gun running and flying supplies to anti-Castro forces. Breshears' account suggests that Ferry was in a similar line of business as Jack Ruby and General Walker. Ferry told Breshears that he worked for New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello and flew supplies, in quotes, for him. As was noted in, if Marcello was involved in the assassination, it may have been because of his support of segregation, not the interests of the mafia. You know, like I said, these guys were freaking huge racist bigots. They did not want integration whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. I can't stress that enough. It's a theme. And it'll come into play here even more when we get to Clinton. Okay. One time in 1963, Breshears says that he was at Ferry's apartment when a man came by that Breshears would later recognize as Lee Harvey Oswald. He described Oswald as a nice-looking young man who was very sexy-looking, but extremely nervous. Oswald spoke softly, and Breshears didn't hear what they said. Ferry became very upset and told Oswald that he shouldn't have come to his house, that he had no business there, that he was not supposed to be there. And if it's true that Oswald was at Ferry's apartment, then it's likely that Ferry did not want Oswald to risk blowing his communist cover by appearing at the residence of a fanatically anti-communist David Ferry. Excuse me. Now, Ferry did not introduce Oswald to Breshears, he said. Breshears estimated that Oswald's visit lasted between 5 and 10 minutes, while an associate waited in a car for him. Breshears estimated Oswald was 15 or 16 feet away when he saw him. Ferry never mentioned Oswald by name to Breshears, and the only thing Ferry said to Breshears about Oswald after the visit was that it wasn't any of Breshears' business, and that the man was into something he couldn't handle, and he was going to get himself hurt. Ferry said he was a screw-up, a mixed-up guy, and had dealings with, and he didn't like it. And the only other time Breshears saw Oswald was when he was with Ferry at the office of Guy Bannister and his partner Hugh Ward, also in 1963. Now, former FBI agent and Garrison investigator William Turner interviewed high-ranking Minuteman Jerry Brooks, and he identified both Bannister and Ward as Minutemen. Brooks was associated with Bannister from 1961 to 1964 and worked at his office. As was noted, Bannister's office was in the Newman Building, and mention of Hugh Ward's name was seldom, if ever, in like newspaper stories of the Garrison investigation. So, Breshears' mention of the name Hugh Ward affirms that he knew something about the Bannister operation, lending further credibility to the claim that he saw Oswald there, as many others did as well. Now, that little tidbit of information also runs highly contrary to the rantings and ravings and stories of Miss Judith Baker, who claims that her and Lee was always at David Ferry's apartment. Always. But this says very clearly that if and when Lee Oswald showed up at David Ferry's apartment, he was not welcome, period. And he was nothing but a screw-up, an oddball. So, we have that. Now let's see. Okay, Bashir, it goes on. I think it's 65. Now Ferry was extremely ill, extremely depressed in 65, and he began to open up about the assassination. At the same time, Bashir's had his own troubles. He was being investigated in connection to a plot by the Minutemen to assassinate President Johnson. Both having been suspects in assassinations plots, Bashir's and Ferry now had something else in common. Ferry told Bashir's about his trip from New Orleans to Galveston, which had taken place the afternoon of the Kennedy assassination. Bashir said Ferry told him that he was supposed to pick up 3 men involved in the assassination and fly them from Galveston and eventually to Cape Town, South Africa, which did not have an extradition treaty with the U.S. So yeah, it's crazy. Bashir recalled that Ferry told him that one of the men had a 2-part Cuban name that included the name Garcia. Now, I'm assuming it's not Manuel Garcia Gonzalez, the famous Dean Andrews guy that he pulled out of thin air. And he said the other 2 were not Cubans. The men never showed up, and Ferry later learned they had flown out on another plane. Ferry didn't tell Bashir's who hired him to fly the 3 men out, but Bashir's was under the impression that it was Carlos Marcello or Sergio Acacia Smith. Smith was close to Guy Bannister in New Orleans, as well as H.L. Hunt in Dallas. Ferry told Bashir's in 65 that there were 3 men involved in the Kennedy shooting, and he was very specific about that. Bashir's could not say, however, whether there were 3 separate shooters as opposed to one doing the shooting and the other 2 helping in some way. Bashir's told the HSCA that Ferry made it very, very clear to him that Ferry could have been prosecuted as a part of the Kennedy assassination conspiracy. If that had happened, Ferry told him in 65 that he would have killed himself. Ferry allegedly told Bashir's that Oswald did not shoot the president. Ferry went on to adamantly point out that he knew Oswald was a poor shooter. Ferry told him that Oswald could not hit a cow 25 feet away with a double-barrel shotgun. He said other people were following Oswald and other men shot the president and used or set Oswald up. Ferry also told Bashir's that Oswald was nonetheless guilty of being involved in the assassination conspiracy, which was a death penalty offense. Ferry told him that the poor job done in investigating the assassination proved to him that there was a government cover-up and that there was communism in the government. Communists in the government. Ferry did not provide Bashir with any information on Jack Ruby. The only thing Ferry discussed with him is how upset he was that the Dallas police allowed Oswald to be killed. He said Oswald's life wasn't worth a plug nickel, and he was set up. Ferry did not tell Bashir's about the details of how Oswald was set up. When the HSCA asked Bashir's about it, he repeated that Ferry told him Oswald was a dupe, a decoy, and that Ferry had told Bashir's that Oswald was in over his head, and he didn't know what he was doing. So, this whole New Orleans aspect to the assassination has always been fascinating to me because I always thought that that's where the key to kind of figuring out the conspiracy, that's where the key lies. When you take a look at the Bannister operation and you really figure out what in the hell Bannister was doing down there and who he was involved with down there in New Orleans and what these guys were doing, the Minutemen, the John Birch Society, the Congress on Racial Equality, fighting these anti-communists, these anti-integration people, and Kennedy had made mention, I believe it was in June of 63, about the Civil Rights Act and that it was coming and that he was going to try to get it passed. And so the heat was on, they looked at civil rights and integration as a communist principle. This is how twisted and warped these guys' brains were back then. They thought that it was the work of communists to want to integrate the races and have equality for all mankind. That's a twisted concept. But it was what they believed. They believed that this country was being run by commie, pinko bastards that were leading us straight into hell. and they believed it to their core. And I want to talk about motive for a second, because Oswald on his own never had a motive to kill Kennedy. Never. And when you ask lone nutters, what's the motive? Oh, well, you don't need a motive because he's just a crazy person. He's a lone nut. He wants to be a big shot. He wanted to be famous, right? He wanted to do this and he wanted to do that. But yet when he's arrested, he don't do shit. He doesn't proclaim, I got that son of a bitch. He doesn't say anything like that. In fact, he vehemently denies these charges. He didn't say anything in custody. He didn't admit to anything in custody. But you have real, verifiable, recorded threats to the president from these far right groups. And they're overlooked. Well, actually, I take that back. They're not overlooked because you know what? And a lot of people don't know this, but when Jim Garrison first started his investigation, he was actually investigating General Walker, whom he gave the code name Eddie Blue to. Of course, Eddie being a form of Edwin, and Blue, his referring to his Blue program in Germany, and Harry Blue for, of course, H.L. Hunt. And when Garrison's investigation became public in 1967, he proclaimed that the radical right, the Minutemen, and wealthy oil men were involved in the Kennedy assassination. Now that allegation soon changed, however, and he dropped all references to the radical right and instead started implicating the CIA, for which he had zero credible evidence. Garrison could not have survived prosecuting the radical right, who had an underground army at their disposal that was actively committing murders of integrationists and African Americans during that era. It is worth noting that although Garrison's public story changed, the author, Jeffrey Caulfield, obtained Garrison's existing files from his family, and most, if not all, pointed to the radical right involvement in the assassination. So, there you have it. They got to Garrison. They did. They got to him. And if you think that's crazy, I've mentioned the name on the show, Leander Perez, before. He was actually a judge in New Orleans with offices in the Camp Street building with Guy Bannister, and he was, of course, a part of the Minutemen and had ties to John Birch Society and General Walker. And I'm telling you, Jim Garrison had no clue. I mean, what he was up against. There's no way he could have gone after the extreme right and survived. They were surrounding him in New Orleans. They were in high positions of power in New Orleans. They were all in the police department. They were all through city management. They were all judges, people of power. No way Jim Garrison would have gotten away with going after them. So the narrative switches to the CIA, and he doesn't mention them again, just like he doesn't mention the mafia. Of course, he was never he was never looking hard at the mafia, but he was looking at the far right in 1966. This was where he started his investigation. Because David Ferry, I believe, let me see if I can find it here real quick. Well, we might run across it here in a little bit. But to jump ahead here a little bit now, Brashears was bothered when the investigators told him his name was mentioned in the book Cover Up by Gary Shaw, stating that he had never given an interview to anybody, and he was troubled at several points during the HSCA interview, believing his cooperation might get him into trouble with the assassination conspirators. Brashears told the HSCA that in 1968, Garrison investigators took him back to New Orleans from California and put him up at the Fontainebleau Hotel on Canal Street. After returning from Garrison's office, he found the room ransacked. He had just come into the room and turned off the lights when 2 gunshots were fired through the window. So, somebody definitely did not want Brashears to tell Garrison anything. And just to tell you a little bit about Brashears, of course, the people on the lone nut side will tell you, well, Brashears was a known liar, and we shouldn't believe anything that he has to say. But he was scared talking to the HSCA, and he was scared talking to Garrison. But the type of guy this is, Brashears, he formed a vigilante group in San Francisco called the Lavender Panthers. Their function was to protect gays from violence in the same way that the Black Panthers protected blacks. On one occasion, when some teenagers stopped outside of a gay bar and started pushing homosexuals around, Brashears and some friends took pool cues and started flailing ass. The aim of the Lavender Panthers, according to Brashears, was to strike terror in the hearts of all these young punks who have been beating up his faggots. Brashears himself had once been severely beaten outside of his gay mission center. Brashears displayed the kind of militancy one would expect of someone who had been involved with the Minutemen. He wasn't some limp-wristed, take it how you can get it kind of guy, He was very militant in his actions. But, as we know, when Ferry was, he told Garrison stuff. He told Garrison investigator stuff. He told Brashears stuff. It's just insane. Now, let's move to the whole Clinton escapade, Clinton, Louisiana deal, where supposedly Oswald shows up in Clinton with Clay Shaw and David Ferry and this big black spooky Cadillac, and he generally makes an ass out of himself and makes himself very noticed by the whole town by signing up and standing in this registered line for black voters and supposedly inquiring about employment opportunities there in Clinton. So, there was a lot of things going on back then, and when I talked about, Ron Lewis's book last year, Flashback, he told us that the reason that Oswald went to Clinton was to start shit. Because of there was something going on over there, and now what I read in this book, what Oswald did in Clinton actually accomplished something, and a lot of people don't really know about what it accomplished, but I'm going to tell you here, because the HSCA and the Garrison investigation didn't really turn up a whole lot from this deal, other than to tell us that it was mainly some kind of a front for Oswald to find employment. But why in the hell would Oswald drive 130 miles away from New Orleans to find a job? It's not like he had a car and he could hop and commute this giant long distance from every day, and he didn't really have the means to uproot his family and start over in some town 130 miles south of New Orleans to work in a mental hospital. It's insane, pardon the pun, to think that would happen. But the House Select Committee on Assassinations determined that that there were 4 white individuals who had personal encounters with Lee Harvey Oswald and Clinton. They failed to appreciate that all 4 of these guys were members of a tight-knit Ku Klux Klan clavern led by Judge John Rarick and his close friend, town council Richard Van Buskirk. Now, Van Buskirk and Rarick worked with Leander Perez in the summer of '63 to draft the free election legislation, which was aimed at depriving Kennedy of the state's electoral votes. Voter registrar Henry Earl Palmer, who also had an encounter with Oswald, was also an associate of, you guessed it, Guy Bannister. The HSCA further failed to note that the FBI had documented that 3 of the 4 Clinton witnesses had antipathy or a violent inclination toward the Corps workers. Now, Corps is an acronym for Congress on Racial Equality Workers. Now, these guys, Rarick and Van Buskirk, created the injunction against Corps and declared that Corps had at least one individual among them who was a member of the Communist Front Group. An action which was taken shortly after Oswald was seen among a group of African Americans who were registering to vote as part of the Corps initiative. The Congress of Racial Equality was the third Senator James Eastland deemed Communist Front Group that Oswald had infiltrated or affected a physical relationship with, in addition to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the NACPA, or the New Orleans Committee for Peaceful Alternatives. Each group had close ties to SCEF, which, as will be shown, is of paramount significance. So Oswald's appearance in the Corps registration line was as phony as the FPCC and the Nakba sagas. The pronouncement that Reds had infiltrated the Corps came 4 days before the raid on SCEF. When it was announced, and that's the Senate Committee on Equality for... I'll get it, but when it was announced, the Reds had infiltrated that organization as well, suggesting that the incidents were directly related. However, none of Oswald's posturing was done with the Kennedy assassination in mind. The segregationists, with their Communist Control Act of '62 in hand, aimed to show, through the seizure of material in the October '63 Perez-Eastland aided raid on SCEF, that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists like Oswald, who were Soviet-directed. Eastland planned on investigating Oswald's product of his imagination chapter of the FPCC before the assassination, which was tantamount to investigating Oswald, as he was the only member. As hoped by the SCEF raid planners, an investigation of Oswald in connection would show that he was a Soviet agent who funded and encouraged violence in the Communist Front groups he infiltrated as part of a world communist movement to defeat the United States, as was predicted in the wording of the Communist Control Act. But in 1962, the United States was on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Injecting the communist threat into civil rights, in effect, riding the Red Scare of the time, was done in an attempt to preserve segregation by outlawing the civil rights movement and its related groups. Oswald was their ringer, with his communist and Communist Front background well established after President Kennedy's trip to Dallas was announced. On September 12, 1963, the individuals behind Oswald, who were involved in the assassination conspiracy, shifted a naive Oswald from the role of ringer to the role of patsy. Now, and included in his book is a newspaper article that plainly states, let me see if we can find it here. Plainly states that this the Corps movement was infiltrated by Reds, and this put a halt to the well, there was ties to the Louisiana Un-American Activities Committee, LUAC. There was subversion and racial unrest hearings. But yeah, this, like I said, there was all kinds of stuff going on, okay? There's all these committees and subcommittees and Senate hearings and all these organizations being investigated and this, that, and the other. And there was all this shit going on down there in New Orleans. And goddamn, Oswald was right in the middle of all of it. And they were using him in more ways than we even know or can comprehend to effect change for the radical right agenda. And it's quite clear from reading this book, okay, that these guys were doers. They were movers and shakers. They got things done. They were, they were always doing something. They were always trying to do something. I can't explain to you enough how badly these guys were anti-communist. And believe me, they thought Kennedy was the biggest communist threat to the United States that ever lived because of what happened in Cuba and his soft stance on communists and the Soviets. Believe me, they hated him. Hated him. And everything that he stood for. Because they didn't want this nation to progress past its primitive ways of segregation and, world peace. No. These guys have been indoctrinated that communism was a big time threat. And, you couldn't tell a communist from another guy, until, they opened their mouth and their beliefs started pouring out. That was a big sticking point for them that, how can you tell who's a communist and who isn't? It's by their actions. And trust me, these guys would never be mistaken for communists. That's for damn sure. Now, Ruth Paine, in 1964, stated that she had heard from a reporter, Lonnie Hudkins of the Houston Post, that Marguerite Oswald was working for Miss Linda Rosenthal as a practical nurse in Fort Worth during September and October of '62. Oswald reportedly told Miss Rosenthal her son was doing important anti-subversive work. Now, this is before the assassination, folks. Hudkins speculated that perhaps Oswald made a deal with the U.S. government to do work on behalf of its anti-subversive endeavors in turn for being granted permission to return to the U.S. from the Soviet Union. Hudkins told the FBI that he was on a fishing expedition in his investigation to see if Oswald could have been a stool pigeon for the CIA or FBI. The FBI interviewed Mrs. Rosenthal, and she told him that she got the impression from Mrs. Oswald that Lee was working for the U.S. government in Russia. Okay? The same year, Bannister, Badeau, and Leander Perez were tying communism to the civil rights movement. The Red Scare intensified. And of course, we have the space race and everything else. Now I want to read you part of a letter because I think it's pretty damning. Okay. Let me flip to it here. Now this is a letter from Baton Rouge Police Detective Joe Cooper. Oh, no, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Wrong one. This is from Hubert Badeau. And now he headed the New Orleans Police Red Squad under Guy Bannister when Guy Bannister was working for the New Orleans Police. Okay. Badeau wrote the below letter to Willie Raynack in 1957. He was a senator. His signature is on the letter. Blah, blah, blah. Now, get a load of this here. He writes, among other things here, and it sounds like a attempt for, maybe get some funding. I have been in contact with an out-of-town person whom I have been grooming to come here and take over the establishment of infiltration into the university and intellectual groups. I will tell you in detail about this when I see you in person. There is another matter which I discussed with Bill Simmons in Jackson, and which I don't care to put in writing at this time. I wish you would contact him as soon as you can so that you may be on guard. You might mention to Mr. Shaw that Senator Eastland told us that this session of Congress intends to amend the Smith Act so that all the state anti-communist laws will be valid and operable. That will be all the more reason for having the state squad. Let me hear from you at your convenience. So right there is proof that in New Orleans, under the tutelage and watch of Guy Bannister, they were grooming individuals to be infiltrators into communist organizations. Okay? And there's one other one here I wanted to tell you about. This one is from Baton Rouge Police Detective Joe Cooper, who reported the meeting between Guy Bannister and General Walker in 1963. Okay? It says, I received your letter today concerning A. Bannister, B. the National States Rights Party, C. Fred Korth. Now on Bannister, I met him at a Carl McIntyre meeting in 1964. This was at the Capitol House Hotel. I believe he was introduced to me by Mr. John East of Zachary, L.A., Louisiana. Or it was Mr. George Ratliff of the radio station Wink of Baton Rouge. I know it was one of those. I heard that he had a file on Oswald, and I was interested in this at the time. I am sending you some copies of some material I had in my files on him. I also heard that Van Buskirk of Clinton, now we mentioned him before, okay? He was one of the people that Lee Oswald met with in Clinton. I also heard that Van Buskirk of Clinton was with him when he died. Now, he's referring to Guy Bannister here, okay? I sent Charles Ward the material I had on him. The National States Rights Party, as far as can be determined, only had a few members here in Baton Rouge. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else worth talking about here. No, I think that's it. So yeah, I mean, can't you imagine getting your hands on Guy Bannister's files that just go missing? I mean, it's crazy. You know, everybody says he died from, a heart attack and natural causes, but it kind of makes you wonder. Because you got Hugh Ward dying, David Ferry dying, Guy Bannister dying. A lot of these, guys from New Orleans end up quickly dying. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on some things today, that maybe a lot of people don't know about. Some things that maybe people haven't heard about before, and make some connections for you, that explain a lot, at least to me, about what was going on in New Orleans and what the hell Oswald was doing. It seems pretty evident to me, especially from what he was doing in Clinton, with the core, with the voting thing, trying to get that kiboshed, the Congress on Racial Equality. They have a giant red communist in their midst, which put off this passing of this bill. And it succeeded, of course, Oswald wasn't mentioned by name, but just his antics and the fact that he was there and that he was present and with all these black folks in Clinton was enough. It was enough for them, to postpone, these meetings in this legislature going on racial equality, and it worked. It worked. And these guys can be tied back to Guy Bannister and General Walker and all these other right-wing racist sumbitches down there in the South, and tied up in a nice, neat little bow. Verifiable, recorded threats to the president. Garrison was investigating them, and all of a sudden he had a real big change of heart. General Walker, he had George de Mohrenschildt and Marguerite Oswald put on surveillance in 1967 through 1969. Why? It was to make sure they didn't talk or be in the position to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. General Walker wrote a letter to somebody explaining that, they were worried about Jack Ruby's talking because he was the only one, not focusing the blame on the far right. That if he died, that if he goes away, or if he opens his mouth, then there's going to be no more obstruction to them coming after them. And they said they were going to make sure that Jack Ruby left the hospital in a box. So, and this is who Jack Ruby was afraid of. In Dallas, the city of hate. So take for what you will. And like I said, in a couple weeks, I'm going to take a little closer look at old Mark Lane. That's for damn sure. And really get into what's going on with him. And next week, I got a really cool show for you. I got a guest that you've never heard from before who's going to be on the show. And we're going to be just tearing in and ripping to shreds the events of November 22nd, 1963, and you're not going to want to miss it. So, folks, this sumbitch is in the can, beamed up to the satellite, down directly to your ears, people. This is your boy. Peace. Benjamin Banger. freemusicarchive.org.